start? Oh, great. Okay. So, hi everyone. My name is Amy Yang, and before I start, I'd like to thank Bracklet for sponsoring this tech talk. Today, I'll be covering new React Redux features, or more accurately, React Redux/Redux Toolkit features. But before we start, I just want to lay out the flow of today's presentation. So first, I'm going to set the context for how I went about approaching new when it came to new features. And then I'm going to give an overview of what React, Redux, and Redux Toolkit are, since the features I'll be talking about or speaking about exist within these technologies. And then I'm going to dive into our new features, combineSlices, which is a part of Redux Toolkit, and withTypes, which is a part of React Redux. So what counts as new? This is obviously a subjective question, but I chose features that came from the latest releases of React Redux and Redux Toolkit. So for Redux Toolkit, I refer to version 2.0, which was released in December of 2023, and for React Redux, I refer to version 9.1, which was released in January of 2024. Now that we got that out of the way, so what are React, Redux, and Redux Toolkit? So React is a JavaScript library that lets you build UI or user interfaces based on individual and reusable components. And depending on how you structure your app and how you let users interact with it, components might need to re-render a new UI/change what is currently on the screen. This is where state comes into play. You can think of state as internal data or information that determines how a component appears and behaves at a certain point in time. And whenever there is a change to that information or data, it signals the component to re-render. However, in plain React, state lives within the components themselves. So if you wanted to manage state across multiple components, or to re-render, or to relate the re-rendering rather, of one component based on the state changes of another, one way, and a common way of doing so, would be through props and prop drilling. Props are essentially a way for parent components to pass information down to their child components. But using this functionality and using it accurately is heavily reliant on understanding the components' relationships to one another. And depending on how you organize your components or how big your application is, this can lead you into prop drill hell, because if you have a deeply nested component, you would have to pass props or state through every component level until they reach the desired destination, even if those components and their re-rendering aren't relevant to the state that's currently being passed. Now you might be thinking, how can we solve this problem? Well, one way is through Redux, a predictable state container for JavaScript applications. Now, I want to preface, Redux was not created because of React's prop drilling issue, but it does fix it in a way because in Redux, components are not reliant on each other in order to update state/cause a re-rendering. This is because it offers a feature called a store, which holds your app's entire state, thus centralizing it. And in order to update or re-render state, you would use an action, which describes the change that happened in your app, and a reducer, which is a function that takes in your app's current state as well as said action and return a new state based essentially on what the action described. Now, remember, this is just a simplified overview of Redux, but it sounds pretty great, right? And all you or I would need in order to use Redux are component files that include the necessary hook methods to connect to the Redux store, an actions file, an action types file, which isn't really required, but it's usually best practice, a store file, and a reducer file. Now, that may not sound like a lot, or maybe it does, but it's not so much the amount of files you have, but rather having to really understand how these files interact with one another and pass information to one another. Thankfully, we have Redux Toolkit now. Redux is recommended approach for writing its logic. One of the best things about Redux Toolkit is that it removes some of the boilerplate that Redux requires, aka some of the files I mentioned in the previous slide. So Redux Toolkit also includes the create slice method, which modularizes your app state into slices, or kind of like mini Redux stores. This method also auto-generates action creators and action types, talking about removing some of that boilerplate from Redux itself, and lets you define reducer functionality within your slice declaration, keeping your reducers close to the slice of state that they affect. However, If you have multiple slices, that still means all of your reducer functions exist separately from one another. And your store needs access to all of them in order to update your app state accordingly. Now, what solves this problem? Configure store, which gives your Redux store access to all of your reducer methods. And it does this by performing a special function called combine reducers, specifically under the hood. So combine reducers combines all of your reducer functions into a single root reducer that manages your app's state. And the code featured by the red outline here represents the workings of combine reducers within configure store through the property reducer. Essentially, you don't really have to think about it. If you use configure store, it'll do it for you. And above, you can actually see the implementation of the create slice method, including the declaration of its associated reducers, aka update user. So this sounds pretty good, right? And don't worry, this isn't a trick rhetorical question like the last one. In fact, combine reducers is so useful that they decided to take that functionality and put it in Redux Toolkit. Only in Redux Toolkit, this feature is called just kidding, it's not a mistake slide. I know that I just threw a lot of information at you guys, so I figured we'd take a second to basically do a quick recap of everything I said so far before we go into the new features. So 1, changes in state are key in component re-rendering. 2, the store in Redux holds your app's complete state. 3, actions hold information related to changes in your app. 4, reducers are functions that update state based on the action passed in. 5, create slice in Redux Toolkit modularizes state into slices. And with create slice, 6, your reducer functionality lives within a slice of state. Bless you. And 7, configure store is a Redux Toolkit method that gives your store access to your reducer methods. And 8, finally, combine reducers combines all of your reducers into one single root reducer. I don't want to say reducer anymore, and it works under the hood for configure store. Okay, now let's actually get into our first new feature with combined slices. So the reason I talked about combined reducers before is because combined slices performs very similarly. It combines all of the slices you pass into it into a single reducer. In this code snippet, you can see the implementation of combined slices highlighted with the red outline, and passed into it is a slice here referenced as user slice as an argument, and referenced below by the property reducer here in configure store. And while this is not a requirement of combined slices, the slices that are passed into it, or the slices of state, were usually created by create slice or through create slice. Now you might be asking, what is actually the difference between combined slices and combined reducers? It's that piece of information all the way on the left there. One very important distinction between combined reducers and combined slices is that combined slices allows for the lazy loading of your reducers at runtime, aka dynamically loading parts of your app like state management logic only when they're needed, which can enhance performance and scalability. And combined slices also returns a reducer function that comes with a few additional methods, including the inject method, which contributes to the lazy loading of reducers by letting you add a slice after you've already initialized your set of reducers. However, this does come with an issue. With lazily loaded reducers, they could potentially manage a slice of state that would not be present in the Redux store until said reducer is injected, essentially meaning that the slice of state that they're working with could evaluate to undefined. This increases the chances of complications in application logic, like components attempting to access this slice of state before the reducer injection, as well as increase the risk of errors in your application because of a lack of additional handling for missing state data or undefined state data. So that's where our second method, the selector method, comes in. This method here is actually more of a safeguard in that if state is undefined for the reducer, the method will evaluate state to the initial state. And if you remember from create slice, initial state is passed in there. So it's essentially going to refer to that state if it's working with a state that's undefined. Yeah, I just want to clarify. As I'm talking about slices and accessing initial state, I'm still referencing slices made through create slice. And finally, the method with lazy loaded slices, which is obviously really easy to say, is more beneficial in the context of TypeScript-based Redux applications. This is because the state shape in TypeScript would be determined by statically included reducers or reducers included at build time. And since lazily loaded slices would not be a part of the initial state, the state you use at runtime could be different from the TypeScript expected state shape, causing type errors. So applying the with lazy loaded slices method on the reducer made by combineSlices alleviates this problem by essentially informing state that additional slices may be added later on. It's basically not trying to blindside state as you're working through your application. And speaking of types and TypeScript, that leads us into our next and last new feature for this presentation, but I'm trying to think, where have we heard of TypeScript before? Oh yes, that's right. Jesse gave a presentation on Tuesday, a fantastic presentation, might I add, on TypeScript, but don't worry, I'm not gonna go too in-depth on TypeScript. I'm just gonna reiterate a couple of important points as I talk about our next feature. So for my presentation, it's just good to remember that because TypeScript is strongly typed, that means that types must be specified when variables, parameters, return values, etc. are declared. And type declarations are really helpful in providing a more error-resistant code environment because they help catch errors in relation to, for example, incorrect types, objects that have missing or excess properties, for example, and overall incorrect function usage before the code is executed. So typing would reduce runtime errors. However, there is one downside to declaring type, and it's that and that typing just takes more time to code, for example, and it opens up the possibility of your code not being that dry. Luckily, there are solutions like withTypes, a method that you can currently use on create async thunk. Create async thunk, this on a higher level understanding, is a Redux Toolkit method that allows us to perform asynchronous tasks in our slices. And the method it has withTypes lets you set up your types once and not have to repeat them in order to use create async thunk in other parts of your application. So with this code example, you can see all of these properties: state, dispatch, reject value, extra, all being typed with the withTypes method. And because of that, you can then import create app async thunk and use it throughout your application wherever you want to apply its functionality without having to type the necessary properties again. Pretty useful, right? In fact, so useful, they decided to take it from Redux Toolkit and apply it within React Redux. Only in React Redux, they're applying this functionality on Redux hooks like useDispatch and useSelector, which are functions that essentially allow your React components to connect to your Redux store. It is labeled the same as with create async thunk, and the implementation is fairly simple. The before code just represents how varied type declaration can be based on the hook that you're using. And the after code just demonstrates the ease and consistency achieved of when you're using withTypes as highlighted in yellow here. This is my works cited. Thank you for listening to my presentation. And if anyone has any questions, don't be afraid to find me afterwards. I'll be more than happy to answer them. And thank you again, Bracklet, for sponsoring this tech talk.